Right, hello again. It's now time to read the last two chapters of The Invisible Dog. Now, we just finished chapter 6, where we spoke about where the story talked about the postman getting into his van and driving away from Mrs. Garrow's house. And that was the picture that I showed you last time. So, chapter 7, The Kennels. Back home again, Janie's mother found her husband still sitting at the breakfast table looking very pleased with life. He waved a letter at her. "What's up?" his wife said. "You look as if you've won the pools." "I haven't won anything," Janie's father said. "Janie has. Do you remember when she was very small, I bought some premium bonds for her?" "Well, they've won her some money, quite a nice sum. Here's the letter telling me so." "Don't tell me it's £500. No, that would be an unbelievable coincidence after what I said about buying a Great Dane puppy." "How much then?" 200. "It won't be enough then," Janie's mother said. "Enough for what?" "Why, to buy one of those puppies. For Janie to buy one, I mean with her own money." They looked at one another. "We might have to add a bit to it," Janie's father said. They looked at one another again and they smiled. "Ring up the kennels," Janie's mother said, "and see if they'll keep the Harlequin until we get there." She listened anxiously to her husband's share of the conversation. "Good morning. I'm inquiring about the pups you advertised. Are they sold?" "I see. But you still have the Harlequin? Dog or bitch?" "Oh, good. That's the one we're interested in. Can you keep him for us?" "Yes, I understand. We must take a chance on that. We'll be with you just as soon as we can. By the way, how much are you asking for him?" The answer to this last question seemed to take some time, but at last Janie's father put the phone down. "The Harlequin is a dog puppy," he said, "and he's not sold. The woman said she couldn't guarantee to keep him for us. She'd sold a couple of the others, but hasn't had anyone after the Harlequin yet." There's Janie's father on the telephone, a very old-fashioned telephone, but this is quite an old book. "How much?" Janie's mother said. She seemed to take a lot of time answering when you asked her that. That's because she was giving me a long spiel about how well bred this litter is and what the mother had won and the fact that the father is champion thingamy nobleman of what's-his-name. You know, the dog that won at Crufts. "So how much?" £500. "I'm awfully sorry," the breeder said when they arrived. "No sooner had you rung off than someone turned up wanting the Harlequin puppy. He's just this moment driven off. You probably passed him on your way here." Janie's parents looked at one another once more and they sighed a joint sigh. "There are still 2 blacks and a blue left," said the breeder. "No," Janie's mother said. "Thanks all the same. It has to be a Harlequin or nothing." "Leave me your address and phone number then," said the breeder. "I might hear of something." "At least Janie doesn't know anything about it," said one to the other as they drove home again, "so she won't be disappointed. And she's got a nice surprise waiting for her when she gets back from school this afternoon." "I didn't even know I had a premium bond," Janie said when they showed her the letter and the cheque. "You never told me." "We don't tell you everything," her father said. £200, Janie said, "nearly enough to buy half a Harlequin Great Dane puppy." "Has it really got to be a Harlequin?" her mother said. "Yes, she said so." "Who said so?" "Mrs. Garrow." "What on earth has Mrs. Garrow got to do with it?" "She saw it." "I don't know what you're talking about," her father said. After tea, Janie took the invisible dog for a walk up the lane. As she passed Mrs. Garrow's cottage, the old lady looked over the wall and said, "Hello, Janie. Better luck next time." "I don't know what you're talking about," Janie thought. "Ask your mum and dad," Mrs. Garrow said, just as though she'd read Janie's mind. "Ask them what?" "Where they went this morning." "Where did you go this morning?" Janie asked when she got home again. "How do you know we went anywhere?" her father said. "I just do." There was a pause. "Tell her," her mother said. At that moment, the phone rang. It was the Great Dane breeder. "I've just this minute had a thought," she said. "Since you just missed that puppy this morning and are set on having a Harlequin, I've had an idea, if you're interested. I have a 9-month-old Harlequin dog that might do you. He's a good, typical specimen." And there they are on the phone. The breeder on one side. Oh, I think that's Great Janie's mother, actually, talking on the telephone. "He's a good specimen with a lovely nature, but he has a fault that spoils him for the show ring." "What sort of fault?" Janie's mother said. "He's got a kink in his tail, a little sort of twist near the end of it. He was born like that, but I've kept him on because he's such a lovable character. Would you like to see him?" They arrived once more at the kennels, this time with Janie. The breeder looked at her as she stood, lead in hand, collar dangling. "That's a biggish collar," she said. "Have you had a Dane before?" "We had one called Rupert," Janie said, "when I was very small, but he was fawn, not a Harlequin like this one." "Which one?" said the breeder. "Janie has an invisible dog," her father said. "He goes everywhere with her. He's never any trouble." "Sit, Henry," Janie said. "Did you say Henry?" said the breeder. "How extraordinary. Hang on, half a tick, I'll fetch the dog." Of course, they all fell in love with him at first sight. Already he seemed enormous, with feet like soup plates. He did not squirm or wriggle as a puppy would have done, but stood steady in black and white dignity, as befitted someone who was almost grown up. "His nose is partly black and partly pink," Janie's father said as the young dogs sniffed at them. "That's all right," the breeder said. "A Harlequin's allowed a butterfly nose." "And he's got one brown eye and one blue," said Janie's mother as he smiled at them. "A wall eye, that's all right too. He's a good typical specimen with a lovely nature, but, like I said, he has a kink in his tail, that little sort of twist near the end of it." As if he understood, the dog slowly wagged his tail. "I like that," Janie said. "I want to buy him, please." "You want to?" the breeder said, smiling. "Have you got enough money of your own, do you think?" "I've got £200, Janie said. "I won't charge you that much," the breeder said. "As I told you, he's no good for showing with that fault in his tail. But I don't think I can give him to you. He's cost me a lot to rear. On the other hand, I feel sure that you'll give him a really good home. So, shall we say £100? Janie put out a hand. "It's a deal," she said. "What's he called?" "You aren't going to believe it," the breeder said. "In fact, I must confess that there's something very strange about all this, but he's called Henry." Janie nodded. It was as though she had expected this news. Carefully, she unbuckled the collar from the invisible dog and fastened it again around the neck of his successor. "Good boy, Henry," she said. Chapter 8. The Twist. About a week later, Janie came out of the front gate and turned up the lane, the lead in her right hand, her dog walking steadily at heel with his long strides, his great head not far below her shoulder. From the buckle of his collar hung a new round metal disc that said, above the telephone number, Henry. There we are. There the two are. Oh, off they go together. They walked up the village until they came to Mrs. Garrow's wall, with the red postbox set into it, and Janie opened the garden gate and went in. Inside the porch of the cottage were Mrs. Garrow's wellies, and leaning in the corner, the long broomstick that she used for sweeping up leaves. Her cat sat on the mat. "My old black cat doesn't like dogs," Mrs. Garrow had said, but to Janie's surprise it stood up and began to rub itself against one of Henry's long legs, purring loudly. Henry looked embarrassed. Janie knocked on the front door, and after a moment old Mrs. Garrow opened it, smiling her crinkly smile. "Hello," Janie said. "This is Henry." "I know that, dear," said Mrs. Garrow. "You showed him to me before, lots of times, don't you remember?" She patted the dog. "Who's a good boy then?" she said. "He's looking ever so well, Janie. You must be proud of him." "I am," Janie said. "Do you see, he's got a butterfly nose and a wall eye." 2 pages at once. Hang on. There's only one thing meant to be wrong with him, though I don't think it matters a bit, and that's the twist in his tail. It was all in the tea leaves, Mrs. Garrow said. I don't understand, Janey said. How can you know these things? Mrs. Garrow let out her usual volley of quacks. Aha, Janey, my dear, she said. That's the twist in the tail. Spelt T-A-L-E, rather than the tail of a dog, which is spelt T-A-I-L. And that's the end of the story. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've thoroughly enjoyed reading it to you, and I know there are lots of other books that he has written, but I'm sure you another time perhaps would like some of the Horrid Henry stories or whatever. But in the meanwhile, I hope you've enjoyed The Invisible Dog. I've thoroughly enjoyed reading it to you, and I'll say good night for now. So, night-night.